Chapter 12. Gratitude. Zuko isn't patient. Waiting has never been one of his strengths. Even when there is nothing useful to be done, he always manages to find something to keep his hands and his mind occupied. Anything to keep out the unpleasant thoughts that threaten to engulf him at every turn. Right now, lying alone in a cave, that is a rather difficult prospect. There's nothing to look at that he hasn't already stared at for hours. Nothing for him to do when he can hardly move. It's a bit easier to breathe today, and his hands feel a bit stronger, but he can move no farther than that. Every time he thinks of moving, every time he tries, something sparks and crackles low in his back. It isn't pain exactly, but it's enough to leave him gasping all the same. There is something wrong with him. Something deeply, horrifically wrong, and he can't quite identify what it is. It was easier, in a way, when he hurt too much to think. He has known all along that he is hurt, but now he can feel the depth of it. Now that his burns are gone and his ribs ache a little less, he isn't so quick to tire. Now he can lie awake for what feels like hours, and in that time, he has no choice but to think. If things are as bad as he suspects, if he is hurt too badly to ever recover, then life as he used to know it is over. His future, or what little remains of it, will turn upside down. He can't go back home, that much is obvious. Even before the injuries, Father never wanted him back. Now that there is something wrong with his spine, something that seems irreparable, he can't even try to convince himself. He is unwanted. Maybe he always has been. It surprises him how little it hurts to admit it. Maybe there is simply enough lingering pain to drown out the shock, but if anything, he feels steadier with the admission. He isn't going home. Not even if he somehow heals enough to leave this cave. Not ever. He thinks he knew as much before his confrontation with Kintaro Bumu. He thinks he can remember a mantra pounding through his head when he leapt onto the man's enormous back. Nothing left to lose. Nothing left to lose. Nothing left to lose. He was only half wrong about that. He's been hurt before, but never this badly. Never so badly that he still can't identify all his own wounds after days of waiting. But not being able to go home, that doesn't feel so bad anymore. He won't have to get his hopes up that one more mission, one more accomplishment might finally earn Father's affection. He won't have to watch all his efforts crumble to dust in his hands. And if he's lucky, he'll never face one of Azula's threats again. No more insults or manipulation. No more favors too steep for him to ever repay. No more tiptoeing around the truth just to keep himself alive. And no more assassins nearly killing him for getting in the way. Kintaro Bumu was Azula's doing, wasn't he? It's the only thing that makes sense to Zuko. Azula has never been one to do things halfway, and if anyone could find and hire a near-mythical assassin, it's her. And if there's one thing she would hire Kintaro for, it's finding the Avatar. The only thing that doesn't seem to fit is the Painted Lady. Azula would hire an assassin. Of course she would. And she would set an assassin out after a child if it meant bringing down the Avatar. But why target the Painted Lady? It doesn't make any sense, unless... A possibility flickers into his mind, but before Zuko can grasp onto it, it fades away. He releases a long sigh. There are still parts of his memory that seem walled off from him, inaccessible for some reason. The Painted Lady must be one of them. Right now, he doesn't think he has the strength to battle his way through those walls to find what lies beneath. The painted lady is real, he knows that much. Real, and the only reason he's still alive. The only chance he has at staying alive. He suspects that he's no more than a mile from Shusoku, but if the painted lady decides to abandon him, he may never be found. He'll waste away in this cave, alone and forgotten. But the painted lady won't leave him. At least he doesn't think so. She's already come back to him 3 times? More? The exact number doesn't matter very much. It's still more than he could have expected. More, he thinks, than she would have bothered with if Zuko was just a passing whim to her. It seems like too much time, too much effort to pour out if she intends to abandon him. Besides, he's seen what she's done for Shusoku. Zuko is one person. Hardly worth her time when there is an entire village she could be helping instead, but he's seen her determination. If she thinks that he's worth the effort, then she'll keep coming back. She's brought him water and blankets, after all. That has to mean something. His hand closes around the neck of the water skin. It does mean something, though most likely not what he hopes. It probably doesn't mean that she cares about him. It probably doesn't mean that his chances of recovery are good. But it does mean that the painted lady is probably human. He doesn't think that a real spirit could bring him a blanket. He isn't even sure that a spirit would understand why he needed a blanket. She's definitely human. His pulse quickens, and he does his best to steady his breathing as bits of his memory come clearer. He remembers staring long and hard at smooth ripples carved into the earth by water. He remembers clambering up onto a roof to wait and watch for the painted lady to appear. He remembers seeing her come closer, very much real and almost near enough to touch. And then, he remembers a flash of light streaming from Kentaro's forehead as Zuko struggled to hold his swords in place to block the imminent blast. He remembers seeing her face uncovered and illuminated for just an instant, but when Zuko strains for the details, it all begins to slip away again. The details blur into one another until all he can remember is the painted lady, concealed by her veil once again. He recognized her. He knows that much. There was a moment, once, when he had a real human face to assign to the painted lady, but now his mind refuses to stretch back that far. The wall around the forbidden parts of his memory reasserts itself, and Zuko has to close his eyes against a wave of dizziness. He knows the painted lady. For now, that has to be enough. He can't push himself any further when it hurts to think too hard. Maybe he'll recognize her again someday. Maybe all the details will eventually snap into place, and the wall cutting him off from some of his memories will crumble. In the meantime, he knows that she is human. He knows that she has been helping him for days with nothing to show for it. Zuko owes her something in return. Even if he can't properly repay her, he ought to show his gratitude somehow. Maybe if he does, she'll see a little more reason to return to him. Spirits know there's nothing else in this for her. The trouble is that he has nothing to offer her. Here in the cave, all he has are his own clothes, and now that he thinks of it, he's fairly certain that his shirt is already gone, likely burned right off his body. He can't even be positive that he'll be awake to thank her when she arrives, and he can't possibly give her anything of value either. Not unless his trunk is still in Shusoku. He may not be able to reach it, but she can. And maybe, if he's extremely lucky, she might accept some of his belongings as payment. It takes a tremendous effort to roll even halfway onto his side, and when he does, Zuko has to rest for a long while. and when the throbbing pain finally eases enough that he can catch his breath, he opens his eyes again. He is exhausted already, but he needs to be certain that she gets his message one way or another. He feels around until he finds a jagged rock the size of his fist, and slowly, carefully, begins to scratch a message into the ground. Though she knows that it's safer to visit at night, it's becoming harder to force herself to wait for sunset. She isn't tired. She's slept for most of the day already, and she just keeps thinking about Zuko. There's so much more for her to do. Cracks still remain in his ribs, and now that he's a little stronger, he needs to eat as well. And if she is rested well enough to heal again, what's the use in waiting? Except for the fact that he's getting better. He was lucid enough to hold a brief conversation last night, and for all she knows, he may already be well enough to remember her. And as the days go on, he'll only grow stronger. Katara has to visit him at night. That's the only way she has a chance of keeping her face hidden. But she doesn't like it. Nor does Momo. When she paints the red streaks on her face and arms far too early, the lemur spends several minutes hiding from her, only to emerge with a shriek and try to snatch the paint jar from her hand. Katara gives him a slight swat and twists the lid back onto the jar before he can stick his hands inside. "You're a terror sometimes, you know that?" Momo snatches the jar and chases it halfway across the clearing before it catches on a raised root and he loses interest. Katara pulls the small package of food at her side out of his grasp when he returns to investigate that too. "Stop it. This is for Zuko. He hasn't eaten in days, but you've spent all day chewing on bugs." The feeling of his name on her tongue startles her. She's avoided saying it for days in a silent hope that he might never remember her if she doesn't admit to knowing him. But his name comes too easily, too naturally. It's warm and soft on her lips, and for a moment, she remembers holding him, his head resting in the crook of her arm. Zuko. It's barely more than a breath, but it escapes against her will. Zuko saved my life. Her face burns and she pinches the bridge of her nose, trying not to smear the careful streaks of red across her face. She needs to get herself under control. Maybe it's ridiculous to think that she can avoid any trouble just by avoiding his name, but she can't risk it. She can't get in the habit of saying his name if there's a chance that she'll slip up in front of him. But she can't hold herself back. Maybe what she really needs is to get it out of her system. To say everything that's on her mind while she's all alone, so that it doesn't slip out later. "Zuko saved my life," she repeats to the empty clearing. "And now I'm trying to save him." Nothing but soft silence comes in reply. Katara doesn't know why it surprises her. There's no one else here. No one else who can answer her. No one else she would trust with this. Still, she almost wishes that someone would answer. Or maybe I already saved him. He's alive. He wouldn't have survived this long on his own, but I kept him here. That counts, doesn't it? She stares at Appa like he might somehow answer. That's really all he did for me, isn't it? He made sure I didn't die, and I did the same for him. That makes us even. Appa just keeps chewing, not looking her way. Answer me! We're even, right? Appa makes a sound that might be either a grunt or a belch. With a groan, Katara tucks the package of food under her arm and crosses the clearing to retrieve her jar of red paint. Why can't it be that simple? She wishes it were. She wants to believe her own lies. But Zuko kept her safe. He threw his life away without a moment's hesitation. He almost died to keep Katara from getting hurt. As much time, as much effort as she's put into healing him, she hasn't had to risk much of anything. If she stops visiting him, he will die. She doesn't want that to happen. Even though it was his own stupid choice to sacrifice himself, she doesn't think she'll be able to live with herself if she lets him go. She never asked him to take this risk, but if he dies, it will be her responsibility. Besides, he's shown her glimpses of a different person beneath the surface. The same, gentler, kinder boy she first met in Ba Sing Se. She can't bring herself to let go of that boy. He is worth saving. If he's real. If that version of Zuko has ever been anything more than an illusion. She begins to think that she's losing her mind with all the questions swirling through her head, but at long last the sun dips below the horizon. Katara pulls on her robes, then her hat. It's still early, possibly too early, but she can't bring herself to wait any longer. She has to see him. Momo tries to follow her out of camp, but even after stopping to scold him, it's barely dark when she reaches the cave. The sky is still streaked with gray, and she hovers outside for a while, just out of sight. She wonders if it's late enough. If he sees her, recognizes her, then it will be over. Then she'll have to give up on the faint chance that the version of Zuko she remembers from Ba Sing Se might come back. She'll have to choose between abandoning him entirely and facing the risks of turning him over to the village. But luckily, Zuko is asleep when she kneels by his side. Though his eyelids flicker at the sound of her feet crunching across the gravel, they don't open. Letting out a slow breath, Katara sets the package of food down within easy reach. It's all dried fruit. Not exactly a proper meal, but it should be enough to keep him fed for a day or two, and, she hopes, unlikely to attract any dangerous animals into the cave. When he's stronger, she can bring him something better. As long as he doesn't recognize her, there will be plenty of chances. For a while, she just watches him sleep. Except for small twitches crossing his forehead, he is more peaceful than she's seen him in ages. Yesterday, he seemed to be a light sleeper, but today, he doesn't stir. Cautiously, she feels his forehead and checks his pulse. Everything seems fine. He's not feverish. His pulse is steady, and when she nudges the water skin by his side, it feels lighter than last night. He's as well as she can hope for. He must just be exhausted. She isn't surprised. Though his injuries are healing, his condition is delicate, and it takes much of his strength to make it through the day. The fact that he is asleep means nothing. Or maybe it's a good thing. It means that he's recovering. But the longer she looks at him, the more she starts to notice something off. It isn't that he's sick. No, he is improving. It's something else. She starts to pull the blanket back to check on his healing chest when she realizes it. He's moved. Not much, barely enough to be noticeable, but he's rolled ever so slightly onto his side, twisted uncomfortably at the waist. At some point during the day, he must have turned partway over onto his side. Maybe that's why he's sleeping so deeply. Moving at all must have been too much for him. But why would he? She pulls the blanket back a little farther and finds a rock lying beside the water skin, and just a few inches away, rough, indistinct scratches in the ground. It's too dark to see at first, but when Katara brings her water to Zuko's chest and the healing light flickers through the cave, she can make out coarse characters carved into the ground. House in Shusoku. Take whatever you want from the trunk. It's all I have to repay you. Beside the words, there is a rough drawing. A map of the village, she thinks, with a large axe drawn over the place where the little house with the crooked door sits at the edge of town. For some reason she can't quite understand, her throat grows tight, and she has to look away, focusing all her energy on mending the remaining damage to his chest and smoothing away all the rough edges, all the pain. Zuko wants to repay her. She isn't sure what's stranger about that, the fact that he thought to show gratitude, or the fact that he didn't think saving her was enough. She doesn't need any of his things. She doesn't want any of them. If there's anything she wants by way of repayment, it's to discover that the kinder side of Zuko, the one she saw in Ba Sing Se, is still in there. That is really him. But she can't ask for that. If it isn't real, she doesn't want it. But she can probably bring back some of his things for him. A change of clothes, spare blankets, anything that he can actually use. That might make it easier for Katara. She might have to use fewer of her own supplies, and that, in a way, might be a small kind of repayment. She does all she can to finish repairing his ribs, then sits back on her heels, thinking. The damage to his back feels too daunting to tackle now, and it's still well before morning. Maybe she can go now and retrieve some of his belongings while he sleeps. She tucks the blanket back up around his shoulders and smooths his hair briefly. It will be the first time since the attack that she ventures out to the village at night, but it seems worthwhile. And certainly easier than untangling the knots of damaged energy in his back. "I'll be back soon," she whispers before she remembers that he can't hear her in his sleep. On an impulse, she grabs the rock he used to carve the message for her and scratches out her own. "Just rest and have something to eat. Repay me by getting better."